I never thought I'd spend my retirement digging through classified archives and chasing ghosts across 2 continents, but here I am, 72 years old, standing in front of a storage unit in Alexandria, Virginia, holding a key that might unlock one of World War II's most deliberately forgotten battles. My name is Robert Mitchell, and for 30 years I served in the United States Army as a military historian. I thought I knew every significant engagement of the North African campaign. I was wrong. It started 6 months ago when my granddaughter Emma, a journalism student at Georgetown University, came to me with a peculiar request. She'd been researching her thesis on wartime censorship when she stumbled across a reference in a footnoted British intelligence report, a single line about the Mersa El Brega incident, classification level above top secret, German records destroyed post-war. The footnote led nowhere. Every cross-reference had been redacted or removed. It was as if someone had taken an eraser to history itself. I'd never heard of any major battle at Mersa El Brega beyond the known engagements in 1941 and 1942. The town itself was just a small coastal settlement in Libya, strategically positioned but hardly the site of anything that would warrant such extreme secrecy. Emma's curiosity was infectious, and honestly, I was bored. My wife, Patricia, had passed away 2 years earlier, and my days had become an endless cycle of morning coffee, afternoon walks, and evening television. I needed purpose again. We started with what we could access publicly. The National Archives had standard documentation about Rommel's Africa Corps operations in the region, the usual back and forth between British and German forces during the Desert War. Nothing unusual, but Emma had inherited my stubbornness. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests with every agency she could think of. Most came back with standard rejections or heavily redacted documents that told us nothing. Then, 3 months ago, we got lucky. An elderly former OSS officer named Harold Brennan reached out after seeing Emma's request circulating through veteran networks. Harold was 94, living in a nursing home in Maryland, and his memory was sharp as a tack. He invited us to visit on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The facility smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, but Harold's room was different. Books lined every available surface, and old photographs covered the walls, images of young men in uniform, standing in deserts and jungles frozen in time. Harold sat in a worn leather chair by the window, afternoon sunlight illuminating the deep lines on his face. "You're asking about Mersa El Brega," he said before we could even introduce ourselves properly. "Specifically, March 1943. Am I right?" Emma and I exchanged glances. She'd never specified a date in her requests. We'd assumed the incident, if it existed, had occurred during one of the known campaigns. "How did you know?" I asked, pulling up a chair while Emma set up her recording device. Harold smiled, a sad expression that seemed to carry decades of weight. "Because I was there, son. Not at the battle itself, but in its aftermath. I was part of the team sent to clean up the mess and make sure nobody ever talked about it again." What Harold told us over the next 3 hours fundamentally changed everything I thought I knew about the North African campaign. In March 1943, while the world's attention was focused on the final stages of the Tunisia campaign and the imminent Allied victory in North Africa, a secret German operation had been underway near Mersa El Brega. The Germans, knowing they were losing the war in Africa, had established a covert research facility in the limestone caves south of the town. They were testing a new type of explosive device, something that combined advanced chemistry with psychological warfare elements. The facility was discovered accidentally by a Free French reconnaissance unit that had gotten separated from the main Allied forces. What they found terrified them enough to break radio silence and call for immediate backup. Within hours, elements from the British 8th Army, American observers, and even some Australian units converged on the location. The Germans, desperate to protect their research and destroy evidence, fought with suicidal determination. The battle lasted 16 hours. Brutal close-quarters combat in the cave systems where artillery and air support were useless. 247 Allied soldiers died in those caves, Harold said, his voice cracking slightly. The Germans lost everyone, over 300 men. They'd rigged the entire facility to collapse. When our boys finally broke through to the main chamber, the Germans detonated everything. The caves came down, buried most of the bodies, destroyed almost all the research. We spent weeks excavating, trying to recover remains and figure out what they'd been working on. What they discovered in the rubble disturbed Allied command so much that orders came down from the highest levels. The battle never happened. The casualties were distributed across other engagements, listed as killed in action at different locations and dates. The German research, what little they recovered, was confiscated and classified beyond top secret. The Free French unit that discovered the facility was sworn to secrecy, their reports destroyed. Even the German High Command seemed willing to let this battle disappear, perhaps embarrassed by whatever had been happening in that facility. But why? Emma asked, leaning forward. What were they researching that was so terrible? Harold shook his head slowly. I never got clearance to know the full details, but I saw some of it. Chemical compounds that affected the nervous system, made men turn on each other, lose their minds. The Germans had been testing it on prisoners. The bodies we found, some of them were our own POWs, British, American, French. What had been done to them was inhumane, even by war standards. The brass decided the world didn't need to know about this particular horror. Better to let it stay buried. Before we left, Harold gave us something precious. A name. Colonel James Whitmore, British Army, had been in command of the excavation and cover-up operation. Harold didn't know if Whitmore was still alive, but he'd been stationed in London after the war. It was our only lead. Finding Colonel Whitmore took another 6 weeks. Emma tracked him through military pension records, cross-referencing with phone directories and property records. He was alive, 98 years old, living in a small flat in Dover with his daughter. When Emma called, explaining our research, there was a long silence on the other end. Finally, a gravelly voice said, I've been waiting for this call for 70 years. I suppose it's time the truth came out. We flew to England in late October. The weather was miserable, cold rain pelting the windows of our rental car as we drove through the Kent countryside toward the coast. Whitmore's daughter, Margaret, a woman in her 70s herself, greeted us at the door with tea and a warning. My father's health is failing, she said, as she led us to a sitting room overlooking the grey English Channel. The doctors say he has perhaps 6 months. When you called, something changed in him. He said he's been carrying this burden too long. Colonel Whitmore sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket over his legs despite the room's warmth. His eyes, however, were alert and focused. Mr. Mitchell, he said, extending a trembling hand. Harold Brennan called to tell me you'd been to see him. Good man, Harold. One of the few I could trust back then. We spent that entire day and the next listening to Whitmore's account. He had documents, carefully preserved in waterproof containers, hidden in his attic for decades. Photographs, maps, personal journals, even some official reports he'd kept despite orders to destroy everything. The battle at Mersa El Brega had been worse than Harold described. The German facility wasn't just researching chemical weapons. They'd been developing interrogation techniques using sensory deprivation combined with drug-induced psychological manipulation. The goal was to create a method of extracting information from captured enemy soldiers that would be undetectable, leaving no physical marks. They'd succeeded. The Allied prisoners they'd experimented on had been reduced to shells of their former selves, capable of revealing every military secret they knew while appearing, to outside observers, to be merely suffering from combat stress. The implications were staggering, Whitmore explained, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. If this research had fallen into the wrong hands, or if the public had learned what the Germans were doing, what we'd found, it could have changed the entire post-war order. The Geneva Conventions were already being drafted. This would have complicated everything. More than that, we'd recovered enough of their research that our own intelligence services wanted to continue it. The Americans, the British, even the Soviets when they got wind of it. Everyone wanted that capability. He paused, looking out at the churning sea. I destroyed most of it, against orders. I'd seen what it did to men, how it stripped away their humanity. I couldn't let that continue, couldn't let us become like them. So I filed my reports, handed over token samples, and burned the rest. They court-martialed me quietly, reduced my rank, but they couldn't make a public case without revealing what they wanted to keep hidden. So they let me retire early, and made sure I understood that silence was the only thing keeping me out of prison. The documents Whitmore gave us were explosive. Detailed maps of the facility, lists of casualties with their real names and units, photographs of the cave system before and after the collapse, and most damning of all, communications between Allied command discussing the cover-up. We had evidence of one of the most deliberately erased military engagements in modern history. Back in Virginia, Emma and I spent weeks verifying everything, cross-referencing Whitmore's documents with what we could access through official channels. Every detail checked out. The casualty lists matched names we found in military cemeteries, soldiers whose death certificates listed different locations and dates. The photographs showed uniform insignias and equipment consistent with the time period. The communications bore the signatures of generals and intelligence chiefs whose roles in World War II were well documented. But we faced a problem. Going public with this information meant challenging the official historical record, accusing multiple governments of conspiracy and cover-up. It meant potentially reopening painful wounds for families who'd been told one story about how their loved ones died, only to learn it was a lie. It meant facing potential legal action from intelligence agencies that might still consider this information classified. Emma wanted to publish immediately. She saw it as a journalist's duty to expose the truth, regardless of consequences. I was more hesitant. I'd spent my career within the military establishment. I understood the reasons for classification, the genuine need for some secrets to protect national security, but I also understood that this was different. This wasn't about protecting sources or methods. This was about hiding a war crime and the Allied response to it. We compromised. Emma would write her thesis using the information, but we'd approach the Department of Defense first, give them an opportunity to declassify the material officially before we went public. It seemed like the right thing to do, respecting the process while ensuring the truth eventually emerged. The DoD response came surprisingly quickly. A representative contacted me within a week, a pleasant young woman named Sarah Chen, who worked in the Office of Historical Documentation. She invited us to a meeting at the Pentagon, said they were very interested in our research and wanted to discuss it in detail. Emma was suspicious, thought it might be a trap, but I'd worked with these offices before. They were usually straightforward about classification issues. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early November. We arrived at the Pentagon visitors entrance at 8 a.m., went through security, and were escorted deep into the building's interior. The conference room they led us to was windowless and secure, the kind of place where sensitive discussions happened. Sarah Chen was there, along with 3 other officials whose names and titles they didn't share. What followed was not a discussion, but an interrogation. They wanted to know every source we'd contacted, every document we'd obtained, every person who knew about our research. They were particularly interested in Whitmore's documents. When I refused to hand them over without assurances about declassification, the atmosphere turned cold. One of the unnamed officials, a gray-haired man with the bearing of a career intelligence officer, leaned forward. "Mr. Mitchell, you're a veteran. You understand classification exists for reasons. These documents, if they're authentic, remain classified under statutes that don't expire. Possessing them is a federal offense. Publishing them would be another. We're offering you an opportunity to cooperate, to work with us on a controlled release of information that protects legitimate national security interests." Emma, bless her stubborn heart, didn't back down. "With all due respect, sir, the people who classified this information are mostly dead. The war ended 80 years ago. The public has a right to know about war crimes committed by both sides and about how their government lied about casualties. That's not a national security issue, that's a transparency issue." The discussion went in circles for 2 hours. They offered us a deal, hand over all documents and sources, agree to a non-disclosure agreement, and they'd work on an official declassification process that might result in a sanitized version of events being released in a few years. No guarantees, no timeline, complete control remaining with the government. It was unacceptable. We left that meeting knowing we'd crossed a line. That evening, my home was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, but my office had been thoroughly searched. Emma's apartment received similar attention. Our computers, our files, everything had been examined. They were looking for Whitmore's documents. Fortunately, we'd been paranoid enough to store everything in that Alexandria storage unit, under my late wife's maiden name, paid for in cash. They wouldn't find it easily. Colonel Whitmore died 3 weeks later. Margaret called to inform us, her voice heavy with grief but also suspicion. "The doctors said it was natural. His heart simply gave out," she explained. "But he'd been doing well, talking about feeling stronger, making plans to see his grandchildren at Christmas. Then suddenly he was gone. I can't prove anything, but the timing seems convenient, doesn't it?" We attended the funeral in Dover, a small ceremony with military honors. As they folded the flag over his coffin, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Whitmore had kept this secret for 70 years, had sacrificed his career to prevent this research from continuing. He'd entrusted us with the truth. We couldn't let him down. Back in the States, we made our move. Emma finished her thesis, incorporating everything we'd learned, and submitted it to her department at Georgetown. Simultaneously, we contacted several journalists we trusted, provided them with copies of the documents and our research. We wanted multiple sources working on this simultaneously, making it impossible to suppress everything. If they came after one of us, the others would still publish. The response was swift and harsh. Georgetown's history department received pressure from unnamed government sources to reject Emma's thesis on national security grounds. Two of the journalists we'd contacted faced visits from federal agents, were told publishing would result in prosecution under espionage statutes. The third journalist, a veteran reporter named Michael Torres with the Washington Post, refused to be intimidated. He'd covered military affairs for 30 years and knew the difference between legitimate classification and government overreach. Michael's investigation, combined with our research, resulted in a front-page article on a Sunday morning in December. The headline read, "Buried Battle: How Allied Forces Hid a World War II War Crime and Its Cover-Up." The story laid out everything: the battle at Mersa El Brega, the German experiments, the Allied casualties, and the decades-long cover-up. Whitmore's documents provided undeniable evidence. The photographs were haunting, particularly images of the cave system and the recovered victims. The reaction was explosive. Historians immediately began calling for official investigations. Veterans groups demanded answers about the casualties, wanted to know if their loved ones were among those whose deaths had been falsified. International media picked up the story, with British and German outlets running their own investigations. The German government, trying to address its complicated history with World War II crimes, actually welcomed the revelation, seeing it as another piece of historical honesty that needed acknowledgement. Within a week, the Department of Defense announced it would conduct a comprehensive review of the classification status of all documents related to the Mersa El Brega incident. The British Ministry of Defense followed suit. Both governments faced immense public pressure to come clean about the entire affair. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Emma's thesis, which had been rejected by Georgetown under pressure, was now being hailed as groundbreaking historical research. She'd been offered positions at 3 different universities. As for me, I faced a different kind of reckoning. The Army, my home for 30 years, was not pleased with my role in exposing this. I received calls from former colleagues, some supportive, others angry that I'd broken ranks and violated the trust of the military establishment. An investigation was opened into whether I'd mishandled classified information. My military pension was temporarily frozen pending the outcome, but I'd made my peace with that. Standing in front of that storage unit in Alexandria that Tuesday afternoon, sorting through Whitmore's documents one last time before handing them over to the official investigation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Patricia would have been proud. She'd always told me to do what was right, even when it was hard, even when it cost something. Emma joined me at the storage unit, bringing coffee and the morning papers. The hearings had begun on Capitol Hill. Witnesses were testifying about the culture of overclassification, about how legitimate secrets often became tools to hide embarrassing truths rather than protect national security. Former intelligence officers were coming forward with their own stories of historical events that had been buried for no good reason. "Grandpa," Emma said, handing me a paper cup, "I got a call this morning from Margaret Whitmore. She wanted to thank us. Said her father would be pleased that his sacrifice meant something after all these years." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. Sacrifice. That's what Whitmore had made, what the soldiers who died in those caves had made, what we were making in a much smaller way by choosing truth over comfort. The full story of Mersa El Brega would take years to completely unravel. Official investigations would confirm what we'd discovered, would add details we didn't have, would identify every soldier who died, and ensure their families finally knew the truth. The German research, what survived Whitmore's bonfire, would be examined by modern scientists and historians, adding another dark chapter to the catalogue of World War II atrocities. But the larger question remained: why? Why had this been hidden for so long? The answer, as it emerged through hearings and investigations, was complex and troubling. Yes, there'd been legitimate concerns about the psychological warfare research becoming public. Yes, there'd been worries about how it might affect post-war negotiations and the establishment of international laws governing warfare. But mostly, it had been hidden because it was embarrassing, because it revealed that even the Allied forces, fighting against fascism and tyranny, had been tempted by the same dark possibilities that drove their enemies. The truth was uncomfortable. In war, everyone became capable of terrible things, and sometimes the difference between heroes and villains was just a matter of who won and got to write the history. The soldiers who died at Mersa El Brega deserved better than to be erased from history because their deaths were inconvenient to the narrative of a clean, just victory. As I locked the storage unit for the last time and handed the key to the federal investigator who'd been assigned to collect the documents, I thought about all those young men buried in those Libyan caves, their names scattered across fake graves throughout North Africa, their families told comfortable lies instead of hard truths. They'd fought and died, doing what they believed was right, stopping a horror that should never have existed. Now, finally, they'd be remembered for it. Emma and I drove back to my house through the early winter darkness. Washington's streets were decorated for Christmas, lights twinkling on every corner, families walking together toward restaurants and shops. Normal life, peaceful life, the kind of life those soldiers in the caves had fought to preserve. They'd never know that their sacrifice had been hidden away like something shameful, but they'd also never know that eventually, against all odds, the truth had found its way out. "What are you going to do now?" Emma asked as we pulled into my driveway. She'd be graduating in the spring, had her pick of graduate programs and job offers. Her career was just beginning, built on the foundation of this investigation. I smiled, thinking about the boxes still in my attic, other research projects I'd started and abandoned over the years. "There are other stories out there," I said. "Other battles that got erased, other truths that got buried. I think maybe I'm not quite done being a historian after all." The next morning I sat in my home office, surrounded by decades of notes and research, and began making calls. If Mersa El Brega had been hidden for 70 years, what else was out there? What other stories needed telling? I'd spent my career working within the system, trusting that the right information would be declassified at the right time, that the truth would eventually emerge through proper channels. Now I understood that sometimes the truth needed help, needed someone willing to dig through storage units and fly across oceans and refuse to accept comfortable lies. Whitmore had tried to do the right thing alone and had been silenced. Harold Brennan had carried his secrets for decades, unable to speak. But together with Emma's persistence and modern tools and a willingness to challenge authority, we'd succeeded. The official Department of Defense report was released in March, 6 months after our investigation began. It confirmed everything. The battle had occurred as described, the casualties were real, the cover-up had been systematic and deliberate. The report included a formal apology to the families of the soldiers whose deaths had been misrepresented and announced that the actual circumstances would be added to official records. Memorials would be updated, death certificates corrected where possible, and the full historical record would be preserved for future generations. Germany's response was equally forthcoming. Their archives released additional documents about the research facility, confirming the nature of the experiments and identifying the officers responsible. Several had faced trial for other war crimes after the war, but these particular atrocities had never been mentioned. Now they'd be added to the historical record, another piece of evidence in the long catalogue of Nazi brutality. Standing at Arlington National Cemetery on a warm spring morning, I watched as they dedicated a new memorial to the casualties of Mersa El Brega. 247 names carved in black granite, finally acknowledged and honored. Emma stood beside me, her Georgetown diploma now official, her thesis having earned highest honors once the pressure to suppress it had lifted. Veterans and family members filled the space, some elderly survivors who'd fought in North Africa, others descendants who'd only recently learned the truth about their relatives' deaths. A Marine Corps honor guard presented colors while a chaplain offered prayers. Generals and politicians gave speeches about sacrifice and truth and the importance of historical honesty. But the moment that mattered most came when an elderly woman approached the memorial, placed her hand on one of the names and whispered, "I finally know what happened to you, Father. I finally know." She turned to me, tears streaming down her face, and simply said, "Thank you. That's why we'd done it. Not for recognition or awards or historical footnotes, but for that moment of truth, for giving people closure they'd been denied for decades." The government had its reasons for classification, some legitimate, some less so, but when those reasons became excuses to hide uncomfortable truths about war and death and human cost, someone needed to push back. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, I remained at the memorial reading through the names. Each one represented a life cut short, a family left with questions, a story that almost disappeared completely. They'd been soldiers doing their duty, stumbling into a horror no one should have encountered, and dying to ensure that horror wouldn't spread. They deserved to be remembered. Emma had already moved on to her next investigation, something about Cold War operations in Southeast Asia. She'd discovered she had a talent for this work, for finding buried stories and forcing them into the light. I'd agreed to help when I could, to use my contacts and experience to open doors she couldn't yet reach. Together, we made a good team, young energy and old knowledge combining to challenge the walls of secrecy that surrounded so much of military history. Walking back to my car through Arlington's peaceful paths, I thought about Colonel Whitmore, about his decision to destroy most of that research despite the consequences. He'd understood something important. Some knowledge, some capabilities were too dangerous to exist, even in the hands of the good guys. The moral high ground required more than just fighting against evil. It required refusing to adopt evil's methods, even when they seemed useful. The Battle of Mersa El Brega was no longer buried. Germany hadn't succeeded in erasing it from history, and neither had the Allied cover-up that followed. The truth had emerged, messy and uncomfortable, but necessary. Those soldiers hadn't died in vain, and they wouldn't be forgotten again. Their sacrifice would be remembered not just as casualties of war, but as victims of something darker, something that needed to be acknowledged and learned from. As I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, my phone buzzed with messages. Other veterans, other historians, other families were reaching out, wanting to share their own stories of battles and operations that had been erased or distorted. The floodgates had opened. Mersa El Brega was just the beginning. There were more truths waiting to be unearthed, more stories demanding to be told. I was 72 years old, supposedly retired, supposedly done with my career as a military historian, but I'd never felt more alive, more purposeful. The work was just beginning, and I intended to see it through. For Patricia, who'd always believed in doing what was right. For Whitmore, who'd sacrificed everything to prevent evil from flourishing. For Harold, who'd carried his burden of silence for decades. And most of all, for those 247 soldiers whose names now stood carved in stone at Arlington, finally honored, finally remembered, finally home.